Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
Imagine a town forged in the fires of industry, rallying around a band of gridiron gladiators. The Pottsville Maroons weren't just a football team, they were the embodiment of a community's grit, determination, and soaring aspirations. In 1925, they clawed their way to the pinnacle of professional football, only to have it all ripped away in a controversy that still echoes throughout the halls of the NFL. A new book is out that tells the complete story of the Pottsville Maroons. It's titled Marooned: The Rise, the Fall, and the Redemption of the NFL's Pottsville Maroons. Maroon plunges you into the heart of this captivating saga with the roar of the crowd where it mingles with the clang of the coal mines. Authors Jeffrey Payne and Darren Hayes chronicled this team's rise from the humble beginnings to the gridiron dominance and everything in between. Experience the thrill of victory as the Maroons conquer their rivals. Their every triumph a testament to the small town spirit conquering the big city odds. And the fall, and how they get the redemption and try to get their championship back. It's all covered in Maroons, and you have a unique opportunity to win an autographed copy from Sports History Network and Pigskin Dispatch. The details are found for this contest at sportshistorynetwork.com, your headquarters for sports yesteryear.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, weightlifting fans and sports fans. Welcome to another edition of No Nonsense, Old School Weightlifting History. You can also find this podcast on Yesterday's Sports. Today, my special guest is my son, Everett, and we're going to be, yes, good to have you, Everett, and we're going to be discussing some weightlifting history, and more specifically, we're going to be discussing how weightlifting has changed over the years. My decade of weightlifting was the 1980s. Some call that the golden age of weightlifting. Many world records were broken during the 1980s. And then we're going to compare that to the current era, which is more of the era that my son grew up in.
Yeah, because I am still weightlifting currently, not competing, but practicing the sport of weightlifting, and I'm keeping up with what's going on in the sport right now. So hopefully we'll be able to, for those of you who don't know much about the sport at all, or maybe you followed the sport a lot back in the golden era and you don't know much about the current affairs, we'll be able to shed some light for you on the differences between what has changed from then to now.
And when we say weightlifting, we're not talking about powerlifting or bodybuilding. We're talking about the snatch and the clean and jerk, the two lifts.
We're talking about the sport called the weightlifting that is in the Olympics.
Correct. So we will start out with, we'll talk about how the weight classes have changed over the years. And I went back to 1920.
And I believe this is going to be an entire episode just on the weight class discussion.
It could be, because there's been a lot of changes. 1896 was the first year that weightlifting was in the Olympics. And then I think a couple more, it might have been in the Olympics one or two more times, but I know for sure in 1912, weightlifting was not in the Olympics. And 1916, weightlifting was not in the Olympics. So 1920 is when weightlifting became a permanent fixture in the Olympics. And in 1920, there was only 5 weight classes. There was the 60 kilo, 132 pounds, 67.5 kilos, that's 148 pounds, 75 kilos, that's 165 pounds, 82.5 is roughly 182 pounds, and anything above 182 pounds, you were considered a heavyweight at that time.
Which
in 1920.
Today's standard would be very surprising to many people that that's as high as the weight classes went.
Yes.
But it was very different sport back at that time. Now we're talking, basically 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago at this stage. An extremely different sport at that time.
That is correct. It was very different, and there just weren't as many large people involved in athletics at that time. So those weight classes stayed the same until 1948. In the 1948 Olympics, they added one weight class. They added the 56 kilo class, which is, what's that, about 114 pounds, Everett?
56.
Yeah, 56.
That would be 120.
123, I believe.
Something around there.
I think 123. And then the 60 kilo class, 67.5, 75, 82.5, those stayed the same. And then again, anything above 182 pounds was a heavyweight. Now in 1952, they added, let's see.
Before we move on to that as well, I think it's just worth noting briefly as well, one of the big differences in the 1920s era. I'm not sure exactly when this started changing, but another major change from back then is there were many more events in the sport compared to the more modern era, where now it's only 2 events. Going back to the 60s, you had 3 events, but back then you had something like 8 different events.
Right. There was all kinds of weird lifts. I don't know what year. I don't know exactly what year that they started. Should have looked that up. I don't know what year it became only 3 lifts.
Honestly, that could be another topic of its own.
Yeah.
Another day.
I didn't get a chance to look that up. 1952. I'm assuming by 1952 it was definitely down to just 3 left. The clean and jerk, the clean and press, and the snatch. Now, in 1952, they added another weight class, so now there is 7 weight classes. They added the 90 kilo weight class, which is roughly 198 pounds. So now anything above 198 pounds was a heavyweight. So I think, that goes to show that by that time, 1952, people were getting larger, and larger men were taking more, they were getting into sports more. So it was a good move that they added that weight class. And that actually stayed that way, the 7 weight classes, until 1976. So 24 years, there was no changes made to the weight classes. There was no weight classes added. until 1976 Olympics.
And I think it's fair to say that 1978, somewhere around there, is kind of, that's roughly where the sport as we know it today kind of began, I would say.
Yes.
That's
agree.
where like most of the major changes had happened. But did they still have the clean and press?
The clean and press was eliminated after the 1972 Olympics.
Right. So I think maybe it would be even fair to say that's kind of where it started.
Yes.
Because for all intents and purposes, that is now the sport we have today, where it is only the snatch and the clean and jerk as the two events.
Okay, so we were talking about the 1972 Olympics. Now, I'm not positive if that was the very last time that the clean and press was part of the competition, because they may have finished the year. I really don't know if because the Olympics was in September. I'm wondering if they finished the year of 1972 still using the press, and then as soon as 1973 started, they eliminated the press. But I've always heard that it was right after the Olympics, so that'd be something interesting to look up. But anyway.
Yeah, you're kind of getting into really nuanced detail there. That would be interesting to know, though.
So then 1976 Olympics, we are now up to 9 weight classes. They added more. They added 2 more weight classes. They added the 52 kilo, that's 114 pounds, and they added the 110 kilo class. That's 242 pounds. So now that was the 242 pound class was now considered heavyweight, and this was the first time anything above 242 pounds. So technically this is a new weight class too. Anything above 242 was now considered a super heavyweight.
Right. So that was the first time that they really started to acknowledge a super
It could
heavy.
have been, slightly it could have been before the Olympics. I think in the World Championships.
Right.
Because
before this, 90 kilo is the last class.
Yes.
And let's say if you weighed 100 kilos, you were still just considered in the 90 kilo class.
Yep. So.
Or they probably would have called it the 90 plus. But there was no super category for going past 90.
19.
Well, no, that couldn't be right. Because you would obviously have an advantage then over the 90 kilo. So it's interesting to think that they would have just not had a super heavyweight class.
19.
But again, as we were saying, this is kind of before the era when there just weren't really heavy people lifting. So I guess if you weighed more than 90 kilos, you could not compete. You were not allowed to compete.
Yeah, you were allowed to. I'm not sure what you mean. Anything above 90 kilos was considered a heavyweight. So you could have had a heavyweight that only weighed 215 pounds, or you could have had a heavyweight that weighed.
So they kind of did have a super heavy. It wasn't called super heavyweight. Yeah.
Now, I think it stayed. I think in 1972 Olympics, I don't think they had the 110 kilo class. I could be wrong. I thought I looked that up. 1972, I don't think they had the 110 kilo class. They may have. They may have added that 110 kilo class in 1972. That's roughly around the time, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s is when you started getting a lot more 300-pound lifters. Of course, Vasily Alexiev was the most famous. He weighed over 300 pounds, and some of the guys he was competing against, Serge Redding, he usually weighed at least 300 pounds. Gerd Bonk from East Germany. So you started to get more and more guys that were in the 300-pound range.
Right. So this is when they started to call that a super heavyweight, because the 110 was considered heavyweight.
110 was heavyweight.
Right. And this is really just a difference in the terminology than anything. Because today, you don't usually hear people call that a heavyweight. Like the class before a super heavy now is not really called a heavyweight. Everyone knows that's what it is, of course. But it's just a bit of difference in terminology there.
Now, so I think it was 1978. It was either 1978 or 1979 when they added the final weight class. 78, I think it was 78. They added the 100 kilo class. So that made it 10 weight classes. 52 kilos, 56, 60, 67 and a half, 75, 82 and a half, 90, 100, 110, and super heavyweight. And it stayed that way for over 20 years, I think. There was 10 weight classes, and they were never changed. And then in 1996 Olympics, now we're getting into more of your era. They changed.
Not quite, but close.
Yeah, not quite your era yet, but they still, in 1996, they still had 10 weight classes, but they changed them.
Well, yeah, this is where things start to get interesting, because you'll notice everything you've been discussing up to this point, you've been only talking about adding weight classes to what there originally was. This is the very first time here in 1996 where they actually changed the categories.
Yes, that is correct. This is the first time that they actually...
Which is to say, all of those 10 classes were wiped.
Yep.
Wiped completely and made
That's
new
right.
ones.
So all the world records that were made before that will never be broken. Unless they go back to these, if they ever go back to these weight classes.
Right.
But...
Well, this is a very strange thing, because... Everybody kind of, like, people that are really involved in the sport, they still know those lifts to be the heaviest lifts of all time, but they're not technically world records anymore, because those records were wiped completely. They're considered the world records of that era. This was the first time that basically everything was reset completely.
And
which is bizarre to think about, because that is, as far as you and I have discussed and as far as we know, we're not sure if there's any other sport that's ever done this, just completely changing categories.
They may have done some changes in wrestling. I don't know, but probably not as drastic.
Maybe.
But of course, we had 1980 Olympics and 1984 Olympics were the boycott years. So 1996. Now, if I remember correctly, the main reason that they changed the weight classes were that the drug testing was getting much more sophisticated, much stricter. During the 1980s, although there was testing, of course, I don't think the testing was as sophisticated. Guys were beating the test. So I think the main reason they changed the weight classes is due to the stricter testing. World records were not getting broken. They were stagnant. No one was breaking world records. So
yeah, and this could be an entire topic of its own. I think we really can't get down this rabbit hole too much of the drug testing, but that was the reasoning behind the changes.
Yes.
And as you'll find out as we continue to get into more modern years here, you will learn that this strategy was not very effective.
No, it wasn't. So 1996, we'll go through the week. So the 52 kilo class now became the 54 kilo class. 56 kilo class now became the 59 kilo class. The 60 kilo class became the 64 kilo class. 67.5 kilos became the 70 kilo class. The 75 kilo only went up 1 kilo. 75 became 76 kilos. 82.5 only went up a half a kilo. Went from 82.5 to 83. The 90 kilos went to 91 kilos. The 100 kilo class went down a kilo, went to 99 kilos. The 110 kilo class became the 108 kilo class. And then anything above 108 kilos was super heavyweight.
And I think it's worth just mentioning briefly, of course, by this point in the history of the sport, women's weightlifting had been introduced. Although we won't get into those classes too much because you can basically just assume anything we're talking about for these men's classes, basically roughly the same things had happened with the women's weight classes as well.
Now, prior to 2000, there were women in weightlifting, and they did have a women's nationals. But 2000 was the first year that women's weightlifting was in the Olympics.
Right.
And that changed everything. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now in 2000, it went from 10 weight classes, and it had been 10. There had been 10 weight classes for almost 30 years. And then in 2000, it went to only 8 weight classes. They took away 2 weight classes. Things really, that's really when things started to change, when they had the women.
Yeah.
Now, I have nothing against
this. There were a lot of changes here because they removed 2 classes, and then this is also when it was changed again.
Right. They changed the weight classes again.
So this time we had another change after only 4 years since that first change, and removing 2 classes at the same time to introduce some of these women's classes into the Olympics. So there's a lot of changes, in
Oh,
this year.
yeah. Everything started to change in 2000. Now, I don't have anything against women being in the Olympics for weightlifting, but why did you have to change the men's weightlifting just because the women were now entering it? Just, all the other sport, again, weightlifting was like the scapegoat, like it always is.
Yeah.
All these other sports, track and field and, all the more popular sports, they don't have any they give out as many medals as they want. But now
they'll add without
right.
removing.
And now they're saying,
Yeah, which is how it should be.
so they used
But with weightlifting being a niche sport, they just don't want to deal with
Yeah.
it, so they tried to take some things out.
So they started taking away from the men's weightlifting when the women entered, which, like I said, I'm not opposed to women lifting in the Olympics, but why, both the men and the women, why do you have to change everything? They don't do it with others.
Just because you've added doesn't mean you need to change.
They don't do it with other sports. So in 2000, we have a 56 kilo class.
And this is where my era now begins.
The first weight class is 56 kilos. Then we go 62 kilos, 69 kilos, 77, 85, 94, 105, and anything above 105 was now a super heavyweight. And I think that was a big change there. Going from, they had 110 kilo class, then it went to 108 kilos, and now it's down to 105. Yeah. So a lot of guys that were in the 110 kilo class now are forced to gain weight because it's a lot of weight. I mean, some guys were able to lose weight, but this is an 11-pound difference. 5 kilos is 11 pounds. So anyone that was in the 110 kilo class either had to lose 11 pounds or they were forced to gain a lot of weight, and that's what a lot of guys did.
Yeah. The fortunate thing in that instance is these two changes happened in very quick succession.
Right.
I imagine that was very difficult to acclimate to, but at least like anybody who had changed classes in 1996, at least they didn't get very used to those classes before having to then change again. And that's difficult, but at least, say if you had a 110 who would move down to the 108, it might not have been too difficult for that 108 to then go down to the 105.
Right.
It is crazy to think that these two changes happened in such quick succession, though.
Yeah, only a few years later, they changed them all again. And so those 8 weight classes stayed. It stayed that way for roughly 20 years. No changes were made, nothing was added, nothing was taken away until the 2020 Olympics. Or it could have been.
Well, not
it could have been a little, a couple years before that at the World Championship.
But it was after the 2016 Olympics. Somewhere between the 2016 Olympics and before the 2020 Olympics.
So probably around 2017, 2018, they changed it again. And now...
And this changes to the classes that we currently have.
Right. Now we're down to only 7 weight classes. We went from 10 weight classes
Yeah, and they removed
And why,
another one.
I don't know why. I still don't know why they're removing weight classes.
Well, again, this is a completely different topic, but all of these changes and everything, removing of classes, most of this ties back again to the drug testing and anti-doping subjects, and all of this is like sort of attempts to punish weightlifting.
Yep.
I guess you could say, or at least that's what they're claiming.
Well, this is a whole nother topic, but and I don't, neither one of us is condoning the use of steroids or any other type of drug.
No.
But why is weightlifting always the scapegoat? Every other sport, there's steroid usage too, but nothing. They don't change any of those sports.
Anybody that's really involved in paying attention to international level sport, nobody's under any delusion at this point that PEDs are being used, obviously, in the highest level of sport. And that's pretty much universally true across all sports. But for some reason, weightlifting is just particularly under the spotlight with this. Like this sport has always been really lambasted about this. And again, like, not to say that we're condoning those things, but it's like this sport has been extremely singled out for
Absolutely.
that. And again, like, on account of that being singled out for that, it's been subjected to all of these changes and removals of categories and things that we just don't see in any other sports for those same reasons.
Yep, that is that.
So this is really where things start to get very strange with constant changing and removing of classes.
And I guess, the International Weightlifting Federation has to take some of the blame too, because they were not exactly cooperative.
No, I mean, that's the whole thing, is that the International Olympic Committee, this is all them going after the International Weightlifting Federation. Right. And again, totally different topic, but there is tons of known corruption that took place inside the IWF, namely with a character called Thomas Ion. If you're at all involved in weightlifting, you'll know exactly who that is and what that story is. But basically, ever since him being the president of the IWF, there was widespread corruption going on of all sorts.
Right.
Totally different topic, but yeah, a lot of this is to kind of push the IWF to start making some changes to try to clean up the sport. And there was not a lot of cooperation from the IWF. Even after the removal of Thomas Ion, there were a lot of old heads still inside the IWF that were just not open to change at all.
So they didn't do themselves any favors. And then again, 4 years later, or maybe it was before this is when things really get crazy, right? Because they only have 5 categories at the 2000.
I'll get into this part. So like we said, those last classes we mentioned that started in the year 2000, those continued at least up until the Rio Olympics. And then somewhere between Rio Olympics in 2016 and Tokyo Olympics in 2020, they were changed again to what are now the current categories, which are 55 kilo, 61 kilo, 67 kilo, 73 kilo, 81, 89, 96, 102, 109, and super heavyweight. And these classes also did not last very long, because now, right as people are starting to get used to these over the course of the past 10 years or so, there are now current talks about changing the classes. Or I shouldn't even say talks, because it is now confirmed that they are going to go ahead and change these classes again. But this is where it really starts to get messy, because even in addition to these changes, so we've had these categories that I just mentioned, we've had these now for around 10 years, 8 to 10 years. But even during that time, this is where things really start getting strange, because up to this point, we've talked about the classes changing a couple of times, and which is very bad for the athletes, by the way. As we briefly touched on, it's extremely difficult to have to change your weight category that you've been training at for however many years, and you're accustomed to being at that body weight. And for those who don't practice the snatch and the clean and jerk, we can tell you from experience that your body needs to get used to a certain weight. Even more so maybe than with general strength training, like with squatting, benching, deadlifting, that sort of thing. Even more so with the snatch and the clean and jerk, you really have to spend time at a body weight to get used to it and feel that because your body is a center of mass and the barbell is a center of mass.
Right.
And those are things that you need to get used to, the feeling of the conjunction between those two. And when you have to change your body weight, that's a very difficult thing to adapt to, and it takes potentially years to grow. If you have to change your body weight by, say, around 5 kilos, that's quite a bit of difference in body weight, and you need potentially years to adapt to that difference.
Yeah.
To be as efficient as possible. There are times where, for example, let's say you went up in body weight by 3 to 5 kilos, you might think by first impression, oh, well, your body weight has gone up, so your performance will also go up. And that is true eventually, but most of the time when you see that, the performance does not go up right away.
Right.
In fact, sometimes it can even go down slightly initially, because you have to get used to moving more of your own body weight, and you have to get used to, it can slow you down initially, where you need to get used to that weight to be able to move as quickly as you did before.
Right. And then you finally you finally get used to it, and then they change it again.
Yeah.
So
yeah, because again, like we said, it can take years to adapt to that, and when you're talking about 8 to 10 years before they change it again, you get very little time to adapt to something before you have to change again. And this has negatively affected a lot of athletes. There's many examples of it, people that have had to move classes multiple times because of these changes, and it's significantly hampered their performances.
now, in the 2024 Olympics, there was only 5 weight classes, right?
Yeah. Yes. And this is where I was trying to go with this, is on top of all these changing of the weight classes, they also started introducing in the Tokyo Olympics 2020, they didn't change the weight classes yet. Like I said, we've had these classes now since after 2016. But what they did change, which was never the case in the past, is they made separate Olympic categories, is what they call them. So in the past, all of the categories were all represented at the Olympics, but now that's no longer the case. This started in 2020. It wasn't a huge difference yet at that time. So in 2020 Olympics, from the total 7, 8, there were 10 total men's categories at this time. So that's interesting to note too, that I think they actually did add back some categories, because we had mentioned that it went below 10 at one point. So right now there are 10 categories, but in the 2020 Olympics, there were 2 of those categories removed. They didn't have the men's 55 kilo class, which is the lightest weight class. And then it also excluded the men's 102. So this was kind of the first example of where this started to become really difficult for athletes, right? Because the classes surrounding the 102, underneath that you have the 96, and above that you have the 109. So 96, 102, 109. In this 2020 Olympics, there is no 102. So if you're somebody who has been competing as a 102 for a number of years, now you're stuck in this very difficult situation where if you are someone who is good enough to go to the Olympics and you are training with the intention and the ambition to go to the Olympics, and you suddenly find out during this Olympic quad that they're going to remove your weight class from the Olympics, well, now you normally train as a 102 and you're forced to either lose a drastic amount of weight or gain a drastic amount of weight in order to get into the Olympics.
Yeah.
And that became a serious problem for essentially everybody inside that 102 category. And it also basically just, even though the class is still included in other competitions outside the Olympics, so it's still involved in the World Championships, in spite of that, by doing this, essentially, it completely ruined the 102 kilo category, because everybody inside of it who was at a high level and someone that's good enough to get into the Olympics, all of them left the category. So now what you're left with is a 102 class that is no longer competitive, essentially. The only athletes left in it are ones that, I mean, obviously still really high international weightlifters, but not at the level needed to qualify for the Olympics. So you're basically left with this husk of a weight class that is being outperformed by athletes lighter than them, because all of the major competitors have fled from that class. So it not only is very difficult for those athletes who had to change the weight class, but it effectively just leaves a pointless weight class in its wake.
Yep.
And this is in 2020, mind you, and this was with only removing 2 classes, and it caused all of these problems. And then you fast forward to the 2024 Paris Olympics, and it was way worse than that.
Yeah.
Because 2020, we're talking about only 2 classes were removed. Then fast forward to the Paris Olympics, there were only 5 categories included in the Olympics. That's 5 down from 8 at the previous one. So at the Paris Olympics, there was only 61, 73, 89, 102, and super. And now, if you've been paying attention, we were just talking about the 102 being left as, oh, well, this is no longer a competitive class because it's not in the Olympics. Well, now they've cut it down even more, and they've taken the one class that was removed last time and put it back in. So now all of those people who fled from that class now have to drastically change their weight again to go back into the 102. And some of them have changed their weight so drastically that they have no idea what to do with themselves anymore, and they just go up to super heavyweight. People who have been following modern weightlifting will know Simon Martirosyan from Armenia is a good example of this. He has changed his class drastically multiple times over the course of these past 8 years or so because of all of these, not just changes in weight classes, but introduction of having separate Olympic categories and those changing as well, and being cut down drastically to only 5 classes with huge jumps between the classes.
Terrible. And the 89 kilo class.
And this was another case where in you had a similar situation to what happened to the 102s in 2020. Because also in 2020 they did have the 81 kilo class as an Olympic category. Now that's missing. So same situation happens again where all of the 81s, they're forced to move up to 89 or down to 73.
8 kilos.
Which is a massive change as well. And everything I described before, it happened again with that class, where 81 used to be one of the most popular, most competitive classes, most famously having Liu Xiaojun leading the pack at that time. And now basically that class was gutted. And you had the same situation where you had a thriving class, probably one of the most competitive weight classes, to then, upon announcing it will not be in the Olympics, basically gone from one of the most popular classes to one of the least competitive classes.
Now, for those who don't know kilos, I know we have most of our listeners are probably from USA, so
right.
For those who don't know kilo, we're talking about an 8 kilo. That is roughly
7 or 8 kilo.
That's jump, roughly,
which is like 20,
almost 20 pounds,
nearly 20,
almost 20 pounds that your body weight.
Yeah, we're talking between like 16 to 18 pounds.
That your body weight has to change one way or the other. You either have to lose a massive amount of weight or gain a massive amount of weight. And it's going to affect you.
And that's really problematic.
Absolutely.
That's really problematic when you think about these guys. These are guys that have pretty much at least close to ideal body compositions for their weight class. You know, in a strength sport, you obviously want to have as much muscle as you can reasonably stack onto your frame without having an unhealthy low amount of body fat. So that's a conundrum, right? Like if you're in this position we're talking about in 2024 where the 81 kilo class suited you perfectly, you had tons of muscle on you, what do you do now? Like you're not going to gain another 16 plus pounds of muscle onto your frame. That's not going to happen. So now you're in a situation where you either have to just put on as much more muscle as you can, and the rest just has to be gaining fat, which is not really that useful. Or you're talking about essentially just being forced to actually lose muscle mass and go down to a class that doesn't suit your body, essentially.
It's a tremendous amount of weight. We're talking almost 20 pounds of body weight that you have to go one way or the other.
Yeah, it's massive.
So the changing of the weight classes has not worked, and now they're changing it again.
The main problem was not just the changing, but like we're saying, having these specifically Olympic categories.
It's added
because at that point it's almost better to just only have those Olympic categories, because it creates this big divide where you have the Olympic contenders just chasing after those classes and struggling to change their weights, and it leaves everyone else that isn't an Olympic contender in this weird space where they're just competing in a class that doesn't have anyone better than them to push them to improve, essentially, in that weight class.
It's had a very detrimental effect on the sport. And it's not getting any better. They want to change it again, and this is why you're not seeing anywhere near the weights that were lifted during the 1980s. And
yeah, it's at least one of the reasons. There are many reasons for sure, but I think this is one of the biggest reasons.
Okay. Do you want to move on to another topic, or you still have more to say about this?
I have a little bit more to say. I just want to wrap up by saying I do think the biggest negative that has happened here is having these separate Olympic categories, for sure. I think the simple changing of classes, as long as it's not too frequent, like we had from 1996 to 2000, that's really extreme to change it in 4 years. But if you look at from 2000 to after 2016, I think it happened. I don't know the exact year where it changed, but it was after 2016. So it was probably somewhere around 2018, 2019, something like that. If you look at that, like that's a pretty big gap. That's more than 16 years that they had those classes. I think that alone is not too bad. That's a lot of time for people to get used to the new classes and everything.
Right.
But so when you have this situation of having Olympic categories, it's as though even though the total list of weight classes hasn't changed, it's basically as though they have. Because everyone has to change their class to try to qualify for the Olympics. So even though the classes haven't changed, they may as well have.
Yeah.
When they do that. And now, on top of all of that chaos that's taken place over these past two Olympics, now they're changing classes again, and presumably they're still going to have, of these classes, some of them are separately going to be Olympic classes.
Well,
so now, as for the new classes, that they're going to change to very soon. I believe it's it's effective on June 1st of this year. So very soon. These new classes for the men will be 60, 65, 71, 79, 88, 98, 110, and super. So once again, not just changes, but also changes in how many classes. We're now going from 10 back down to 8 again. So it's just all over the place with changes and Olympic categories and changing the number of classes back up and back down. It's just a complete mess.
Yep.
And then presumably of these 8 classes, probably only 5 of them will be Olympic categories. And I'm not sure if that's been announced yet. I'm hoping that it has been, because if the athletes just need a heads up here, I think, at least to know what classes to go to.
Right.
I mean, fortunately, these classes, most of them are not huge changes from the previous comparable classes to them. Like, for example, it's going from an 89 class to an 88 class, or going from a 96 class to a 98 class, going from a 109 to a 110. So there aren't huge changes there, but even though it doesn't sound that bad, again, it's still really bad because of the Olympic categories. So when you only have 5 Olympic categories, you're still really you're basically just prohibiting people from being in the weight class that is ideal for their body. That's the whole purpose of having a decent number of weight classes, like from 10 to 8 weight classes, is that allows every person to find their ideal weight class. And as soon as you take those away for the Olympics, it's like it ruins the entire point.
They've gone backwards.
Because now the Olympics is supposed to be the pinnacle of performance, And it's essentially not, because you're forcing athletes to basically go outside of what their ideal body composition would be to chase after these classes. And if you look at results, since all of this craziness has been going on, consistently there are better results and more interesting competitions taking place at the World Championships than there are at the Olympics, for this reason as well.
They've gone backwards.
Yeah.
1920, we had 5 weight classes. Here we are 125 years later, 105 years later, and we're back to 5. Where are we going? We're going backwards.
Yeah, so it's a complete mess, and this has probably even been hard to follow for anybody listening. And we've done our best to try to explain all of this here, but there's just so much to unpack and so many changes that have happened over such a short period of time that I'm sure it's difficult to even follow along with all of this. But that's essentially what the state of the sport has been.
Yep.
Over the past 8 years has been a complete mess as far as the weight classes. And that's not even getting into other topics. There's lots of other things that have been a complete mess as well.
Well, the next thing I wanted to talk about was a very controversial topic, the press out rule.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we should leave this off here for episode 2. Because there's, the press out rule is a big one, and there's lots of things, lots of differences between the way that judging was conducted between your era and mine. That has taken a turn for the worse, I would say.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. The heel gets the heat. The babyface gets the cheers. But the jobber gets, well, the job done. And speaking of jobbers, Barry Horowitz wasn't there to win titles. He was there to build them. By selling every move, every storyline, and every new star that stepped into the ring. He was the secret sauce. And now, he's the headline in his new book titled, Wrestling is My Gimmick, My Life on the Wrong Side of the 3 Count. This memoir is a deep dive into wrestling's most underrated position and the man who made it an art form. Whether you're a fan of wrestling, a fan of sports history, or just love a great story, this book is for you. Again, that's Wrestling is My Gimmick by Barry Horowitz. Grab your copy today before the count strikes 3.